The human brain is an exceedingly complex organ that, despite the last century of study being devoted to it by highly intelligent doctors, scientists, and more recently, a random YouTuber sitting in front of a camera, it is far from revealing its secrets that it holds. What is consciousness? Could it be a collection of cells within our brain case? Could it be something more? Furthermore, injuries to the brains can impact the same area of the cerebrum in two people who are like the same age, sex, and mental capabilities, yet one will fare better than the other. Even past that, developmental challenges are something that humanity has been trying to understand for like a long time, more so how to help people struggling with those issues all throughout our species' like entirety on this rock. It's been a big thing that we know the brain can have issues. How do we address it? It's this fundamental lack of understanding and the odd circumstances surrounding the 3-pound chemoelectric anxiety meat within our heads that keeps us curious and perplexed about the operational status and function, and will likely continue to do so quite easily for the next 100 years. And one of these reasons for this is what we will be discussing today. How much control does your brain have over your body? The typical line of thinking when it concerns our actual body's stability and life control functions is that the brain itself is just in control of the voluntary functions of the body, such as movement, with autonomous functions kind of like running in the background, and you really don't have to think about, like, for instance, your heart beating, or blinking, or even consciously taking our next breath. Although you now have to consciously think about taking your next breath because we're talking about it. And this would mean that while you are consciously inhabiting this meat mech, there are functions carrying out behind the scene that allows you to survive and continue on. But then you have to wonder, how might you be able to like influence any of these autonomous functions? The mind-body connection is a very real thing. Anecdotally, I've actually become aware back when I was 16, I played football. I would actually think about slowing down my heart rate during things like football practice if my heart rate was really, really high. I would think about it, and it would drop at least 20 beats per minute usually. If you ask me how I do this, I have absolutely zero clue how I do it, but I just can. And this is probably what contributes to the overall health anxiety I have, because if I can affect my own heart rate just by thinking about it, well, what if I think about it too much? Exactly. That's why you shouldn't think about it. But back to the mind-body connection, we know with things like weightlifting, for instance, if you are a complete newbie at it, your neurons will adapt with new information to like pushing and pulling with greater force, making you more adept at recruiting muscle fibers to help you actually continue to lift. And this physical recruitment of muscle is integral for your body adapting to the needs of the brain. And if your body can adapt to the needs of the brain, and your brain adapt to the needs of your body in such a manner, then this means that you should be able to adapt in a way that could potentially be harmful more than good, which shouldn't surprise anyone. Which really shouldn't, it's not surprising that our bodies do adapt in non-beneficial ways. For instance, in today's society, the reason we actually have an obesity epidemic is because our food is super caloric dense. Back in the day, I mean, you would find some berries to eat and you could eat some caribou, but the fact is that there wasn't as much energy contained within the food as there is now, especially for size. You take away, and I'm just sound like one of those health people real quick, but when we removed fiber is largely insoluble. It doesn't really contribute a lot of calories to the body. That took up the bulk of our food, especially when eating plants. We removed those, so now we're just packing in the nutrients and calories. So one of the ways that our body has adapted previously was to low energy environments, where now we have high energy environments and our bodies don't know how to deal with it. In fact, it's been stated that possibly one way in the future that we can actually address this issue is by changing our genetics actually to deal with higher calorie foods. Of course, that's while times are good. Our first famine, like in the future, you're absolutely screwed if you are adapted to only eating high energy food and not low energy food. So maybe don't mess with that. Maybe go to the gym and just eat in a caloric deficit. But anyways, moving on. The point of this rambling is that we exercise control over our bodies in ways that we are only just beginning to acknowledge as a real thing. Despite all throughout human history that has been referenced, even colloquialisms such as "you're dying of a broken heart," those have cropped up and become accepted as reality. But even with that information applied to it, few actually believe it's a real thing. But is there truth to it in a way that we just haven't considered before? Well, let's discuss that in today's episode. Also, I don't know if anybody really cares. I lost my wedding ring on the car ride home yesterday, so that's why it's gone. I don't know if anybody actually cares about that. But anyways, before jumping into it, I want to say thank you guys for your continued support on this channel. I am still trying to figure out where exactly I'm going with it. I love telling horror stories, but I have noticed more and more that science continues to creep in from my main channel, which I do enjoy a lot, and I hope you do as well. So if you do, leaving a like definitely helps. It helps others find this video as well. And if you want to subscribe, I really do appreciate your support on this, because that would be awesome. But let's discuss the Gibbons twins and discuss the strangeness surrounding and bizarre end-of-life event. So like all good stories, let's start from the beginning. The subject of today is the life and expiration of at least one of the twins, known as the Silent Twins, or June and Jennifer Gibbons. June and Jennifer were born on April 11th, 1963, to the parents of Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons. They would move from Barbados to the United Kingdom, tough break, in the 1960s, known as the Windrush generation. This was a push by many Caribbean people migrating to North America and Europe, and this was encouraged by the governments because a lot of men had met their end during the war, and people got to be replaced. It's just kind of like, the natural order of things. The mother was a housewife, and Aubrey would work as a tech for the Royal Air Force. The twins would also have siblings: Greta, who was born in 1957, David, who was born in 1959, and Rosie, who was born in 1967, which had the most perfect vehicle ever to grace this planet constructed, the 1967 Impala Fastback. My God, literal art that you could drive. Anyhow, before I get completely sidetracked on that, in the 1960s, Aubrey would come into some good fortune after staying with a relative in Coventry, where he would be accepted on as a staff technician. From here, the standard set of events would happen. Gloria would follow him soon after with Greta and David, and while there, the twins would be born in a military hospital in Aden, Yemen, where the father had currently been deployed. At the conclusion of his deployment, the family would then be stationed in England at first, and then ultimately in Haverfordwest in Wales. During the first few years of life, the twins began to display some very odd characteristics. It began normally enough. Twins typically are inseparable and tend to have really strong bonds. I say tend to because there are always outliers, but it is well documented that twins remain close to one another, and some have even said that they can feel when something is wrong with the other, even if they're not close by. Sounds sort of ridiculous until you realize in physics, there are plenty of things that actually can happen, and with the human race, we don't know everything concerning the fabric of reality. And so, for instance, particles can exist in two places at once in some respects. Now, I'm not here to argue the idea of remote connections, though, because, that can probably get way out there. Just know, typically twins will report that they know something is up with the other twin, like if they're hurt or down bad in some way because they got rejected at a nightclub. Doesn't mean that they're always right. It just is something to kind of keep in mind. So June and Jennifer began to develop their own language, which originally began as Bajan Creole. Bajan Creole is an English-based language with African and British influence spoken on the Caribbean islands, such as Barbados. And I'm 80% sure I mispronounced that. It happens. However, for the twins, this form of language would be sped up considerably, which made it difficult for others to understand them. This would prove to cause an issue socially amongst their peers, but there were other issues that stood out, making it more difficult for them to be socially accepted. See, around this time, considering it was the 60s and they were in Wales, they would be the only black children in the area, which led to them to be ostracized in school and largely in the community as well. This would traumatize the children to the point that they would turn inward towards one another, it's probably what I would do too, rather than socialize with the peers because they were being jackasses. But this may have just exacerbated the problems to new heights. The school administrators would actually take notice of this bullying of the twins and what they would receive and dismiss them early so that they didn't have to deal with the others in school. Due to the isolation from the rest of the student body and the aforementioned inward turning to kind of meet their social needs, the twins' language would further develop and become something more idiosyncratic. Idiosyncrasies are essentially strange little quirks that everyone has that influences how they act and operate. Otherwise, we'd just be like gray blobs walking around, but talking the same. It'd be boring. But this could be as simple as maybe a couple who spends a few years together, adopting rituals that the other does, and changing the way they speak to one another. Through time, people who spend enough time together will actually create a version of their own language as long as it's a beneficial relationship. And this seems very natural for people to do, however. But like most things, it requires a little bit of moderation. You just don't want to fly out there and do it no matter what. The twins would have no other outlet and break into the territory of cryptophagia. And what's that, I hear you asking? Well, I'm glad you asked, even if you didn't. Cryptophagia is basically the previously mentioned formation of language, but what appears to be an unhealthy degree. Now, there is something to note about this. What makes it unhealthy or healthy exactly is up to debate. Twins are known to engage in cryptophagia quite frequently. it said that roughly 50% of twins will create their own language together. It was first identified as maybe like a trait of autism, but because of how common it actually is, it does not appear that it could really be considered a mental disorder of some sort, and instead, it's just something that may happen. When you have that many people, I mean, it is what it is. So a similar line of thinking is actually sort of like with cancer. I, for one, I'm about to just take a stance here. I think cancer is a biological punk ass, which I'm pretty sure I'm in good company in thinking. I know, very brave of me. But more recently, it's been discovered tumors are actually exceedingly common in the body. Our body just ends up destroying them kind of more regularly than we originally thought. So does that mean cancer itself is a disorder, or is it the standard operation of the body? It's honestly hard to say because it's kind of common in all of us. So then it's not an order or disorder, it's just life. Although if it gets out of control, obviously this can lead to some issues. The same could be possibly connected to cryptophagia. It is assumed that a delay in the phonological development is one that like both twins are currently experiencing, because the twins can communicate with one another in a way that they can understand, but nobody else seems to be able to. This further delays twins' development, as they can talk to one another and do not really need to seek outside interactions as much as like an individual would need to. This can lead to them to become isolated as a duo from the community for some time before it is corrected. I find it interesting because if they are maternal twins, they come from the same sperm and egg, and that essentially split, meaning that all the information to create them is there. And this makes them fairly similar to one another in like a lot of ways. In fact, I always like to just sneak in like a story I have. I used to actually date a twin back in the day before she appears to have completely lost her grip on reality due to current times. But what I find interesting is if they both seem to have the exact same mentality shift at the exact same time, which they did from what I can tell, where did that come from? I mean, it might suggest similar brain patterns firing, allowing them to enter the same point on life at the same time, and if given the same stimulus, they would both arrive at the same conclusion due to the similarities in their brains. Now, this is just me talking. I don't know enough about her anymore, or like her personal life, or her sister at this point, but it just kind of seems like these things happen at exactly the same time, and they're twins. But anyhow, the twins with cryptophagia would begin hitting levels that would usually indicate that there was a problem brewing. They would kind of start to mirror one another, and now I'm no psychologist, but this would indicate that there is a poor sense of self, where you end and your twin begins sort of scenario. It's kind of blurred. The girls would continue to attend school, but would refuse to read or write. So, that's probably not good for their education. But then around 1976, during school vaccinations, one of the medics actually would note an impassive behavior who they would find a little odd, where they would go on to notify a psychologist who specializes in pre-adults. And from here, the twins would meet a few psychologists in an attempt to kind of get them on the right track. But this would prove wholly unsuccessful as the issue continued to persist. Eventually, more drastic measures would be taken in order to have the twins actually continue progressing as individuals rather than as a unit, and they were sent to separate boarding schools. But something odd would happen during these attempts. Rather than branch out and begin to form their individualistic selves, they would completely go catatonic. As soon as they were separated from one another, they wouldn't speak, they would just withdraw from social interactions entirely, proving that this issue had its roots quite deep within the twins. Realizing that this was no way to live, eventually the twins would be brought back together, which would just amplify the original issue even further. They did have some creative outlets and even wrote some books. However, it highlighted potentially a parasocial issue, or at least a social issue, forming within the twins that is just kind of bouncing off one another, continuing to evolve into a bigger and bigger problem. The books that they would write would frequently involve some form of criminal activity, such as violence or other non-consensual issues. One of these books would actually be published, and it's known as the Pepsi Cola Addict. This may denote that the twins were struggling with something that was not known to the parents as far as, we know, but again, I'm no psychologist, that's just what it appears to me. As their isolation grew, they would begin to kind of get into taking substances that alter the brain, as well as drinking adult beverages after meeting up with a man named Lance, and then kind of just finding his family, and then meeting his brothers, who they would then kind of just party with and frequently imbibe substances regularly. Their writings eventually became their reality as they would commit crimes such as vandalism, petty theft, and even going as far as arson. The aforementioned writings would also begin to manifest in the relationship between June and Jennifer, with both attempting at one point or another to take the other out unsuccessfully and becoming worried that the other wasn't really their twin, but acknowledging there were no differences between one another. Both yearned to be free of the other, but couldn't seem to make the leap. This would land them in Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security mental health hospital, and now during this time frame in the UK, there did exist something called the Mental Health Act of 1983 that would result in their indefinite detention, and this would land them in the hospital for a little over 11 years. June would go on to blame their incarceration in the hospital on the fact that they were selectively mute, which is highly likely to be the case given that those who make no noise typically don't change their circumstances. It is an unfortunate part of the human condition. She would go on to mention how juvenile delinquents get 2 years in prison. We got 12 years of hell because we didn't speak. We lost hope, really. I wrote a letter to the Queen asking her to help us out, but we were trapped. I mean, I don't know, man. A person from a mental hospital writing the Queen, I don't really know how much she's gonna do to help that situation, honestly. So, yeah. I don't know. To me, this kind of indicates that there's something else going on mentally, because that's not the typical chain of command that you want to go up to get help. But it was around this time that they would actually be placed on high doses of antipsychotic medications, and now this is a bit interesting as it shows something else was going on besides just your standard misdiagnosis. The twins, clearly based on behavior and attempt to self-medicate, as they said the whiskey loosened the tongue, meant that there were likely some mental issues. Early in the selective muteness process, this can be an early indicator, again, that something is wrong. As they turn to substances to alleviate their mental struggles, this is something that is frequently seen in those who are suffering from schizophrenia. Essentially, they are attempting to deal with the issue presented by the mental illness itself, but unfortunately, it's not very effective long-term, and actually, it completely screws you up long-term. But what's more interesting is if you take a look at the letters and diary entries written by the sisters during their incarceration at the hospital, it showed they had a strong grasp on the English language and were quite intelligent. However, antipsychotic medications can make you lose focus and ultimately derail your ability to think in cohesive ways. They've gotten better over time, but the 90s and 80s version, not that great. One letter in particular is of extreme interest as it would herald what was about to happen. Jennifer wrote to June, "My dear June, I agree a lot with you about we too being old spinsters left on the shelf. Because to be honest, I've had enough of men. Any relationship always ends for me. I can do without them. You're my only relationship. I know I'll die young and way before you, but it doesn't really matter. I only hope you'll be happy still." In March of 1993, after 11 years at Broadmoor, the twins finally would be released to the Caswell Clinic, which was a downgraded medium security institution in Wales. But just prior to their release, however, like literally the day before, Jennifer noted that she didn't feel too well. She said she felt weak and tired. The next day, on March 9th, 1993, Jennifer would actually drip off to sleep in June's lap and never open her eyes again. She would be taken to the hospital where she succumbed shortly after to a condition known as myocarditis, which that's inflammation of the heart tissue, but nothing could be really found in her system, whether it be poison, drugs, alcohol, or an infection that would indicate that she would have developed myocarditis just suddenly and out of nowhere. Just prior to this, there was a conversation that serves to make this entire event more strange. Jennifer would go on and to have a conversation and during the interview with NPR, and the interviewer was quoted as saying, "We had quite a jolly conversation to begin with, and then suddenly in the middle of the conversation, Jennifer said, 'Marjorie, Marjorie, I'm going to have to die.' And I sort of laughed. And I sort of said, 'What? Don't be silly. You know you're just about to be free from Broadmoor. Why are you going to have to die? You're not ill.' And then she said, 'Because we've decided.' At that point, I got very, very frightened because I could see that they meant it. Strangely enough, it appears that they had come to the conclusion for that one of them to truly move on with life, one of them would have to take a dirt nap. June would remain at Caswell Clinic, where she would mourn the loss of her sister, but was also relieved as it had brought her the freedom that she desperately wanted. After a year at the clinic, she had almost done a complete 180 and was deemed well enough to be released on parole. She was quoted as saying, "I feel like I'm living for her. I think that's what she would have wanted, for me to go on living for her. Every day I wake up and say to myself, well, it's one more day for me, but it's one more day for my sister as well. I live for her, and what I see and do, she does as well. Am I lucky or something to still be alive while she's gone? I thought I'd never get over her death. but it made me 10 times stronger. From here, June was released into a halfway house, and then she scooped up an apartment after that with very little issue. It seems her life from this point on would go on to what is deemed to be completely normal, and still lives a normal life near her family. She is willing to speak to anyone who asks questions about it very easily, and her selective muteness has completely evaporated as she held up her end of the bargain with her sister and lives a completely average life now. Now, obviously, there are a few things here that may help to explain the return to normality, I suppose. First, if the twins are indeed schizophrenic, proper medication would very likely have helped the situation tremendously, as well as getting clean from drugs and alcohol. This may help to explain why June would suddenly improve without her sister, as the medications would halt a lot of the symptoms associated with mental disorders. Along with this, the animosity that they would feel towards one another during these exchanges, yet completely enmeshed with one another, would cause very intense feelings that, once the issue was severed, that would provide some relief and calmness. I personally think, though, that the medication being given to them in the correct doses was likely the best thing for June in at least this situation. Now for the more bizarre topic, Jennifer's end. Many times people know, or kind of know, when the end is nigh, so to speak. An impending sense of doom causing dread can overcome a person on the day that they are biologically supposed to meet their end, as chemical reactions in the body have already started heralding in the knowledge of there's an issue mounting. If you get hit by a bus, to the contrary, you likely won't have any impending sense of doom or really anything at all because you just got hit by a bus. With Jennifer, during their conversation, it appeared that she was already aware of her end and it was on the horizon. So the question becomes, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Jennifer influence her end, or did her end influence her behavior and knowledge of it? There is something known as a psychogenic death. This phenomenon has been cited all throughout the world by native people, Western society, the Far East. It matters very little. It's endemic to our species. It's just a very human condition. And it goes back to our conversation about how the brain has more influence over the body than you might imagine. In a psychogenic death, the person essentially gives up on the idea of surviving. Perhaps they're in a war camp or trapped somehow. They know there's really no chance of survival, or at least very little chance, which can induce an extreme psychosomatic response. They will become incredibly passive, I guess you could call it, and accept their fate as they regress, resign, and are marked by extreme feelings of apathy. There's actually a case of a man who was 37 years old who hurt his back with a herniated disc. The surgery did fix the issue, but he still had a backache just right after the surgery. So he thought it had been completely that didn't work, I'm screwed for life, and following that, he would experience a psychogenic death and then died one day later. At autopsy, histopathologic and toxicology kind of examinations found that nothing should have taken him out, yet he was still a body on the table. The mind is an absolute powerful piece of meat, and while the age-old adage of dying of a broken heart is scoffed at in the medical community, it appears that when you give up, truly give up, you can have impacts on how your body functions, if it just functions well or doesn't. And there's actually something to be said about the placebo effect. In fact, they did something, I believe it was a test with creatine. So with creatine, what they found was it was just as important for you to believe the effects of creatine were making you stronger as it was for creatine to actually help you build muscle. So I think it was they did a double-blind study. I'm listening to this third hand, and now you're listening to it fourth hand. But the point is that when they gave people placebos and said it was creatine, they got stronger and their lift numbers went up, as opposed to the people who got creatine and were told it's not creatine. Now, something to note, it's not completely known how this happens. Perhaps a depressed activity in the brain disrupts autonomous functions, making it easier for the body to fall into dysregulation, and ultimately that results in your end. But what is known is it does happen. So did Jennifer die a psychogenic death? It is entirely possible. However, with that said, it should also be known that there are also issues with antipsychotic drugs. And I want you to remember that Jennifer, not June, developed tardive dyskinesia, which essentially is a neurological condition resulting in involuntary repetitive movements. You don't plan it to happen, it just happens. And this known condition strikes those who use antipsychotics, and even with the medication adjusted afterwards, it may show that Jennifer did have a sensitivity to the medication, and perhaps June did not. The other thing to note about antipsychotic medications is under certain conditions, it can absolutely mess with your heart. Antipsychotic-induced heart failure is a consequence of prior direct cardiac lesions in the response to drug stimuli. In a sense, lesions can form in your heart due to the medication being in the system, resulting in the inflammation of the heart tissue in the absence of all non-prescribed medications and substances, meaning that if they tested Jennifer for anything toxic that she wasn't supposed to be on, they wouldn't find it. However, knowing that she was on antipsychotics, they wouldn't have to test for it. Just be like, yeah, she's on antipsychotics. But this could well have caused her heart failure. A person who has myocarditis may feel like they're tired or run down or wore out because their heart is pumping ineffectively. And this may give their brain the signal that they are about to drop, allowing for her to communicate that in the interview. It appears Jennifer may have had an increased sensitivity to this particular medication that she was on in comparison to her sister, and this is not uncommon for twins to have different allergies or tolerances for certain substances. The reasoning is, just because the foundation is the same doesn't mean like the environment cannot play a role in how your body functions. Nutrients differences, food availability, stressors, they all play a part in your internal chemistry and how it operates. So ultimately, what took Jennifer out while June survived? It's hard to say with 100% accuracy what it was. We know psychogenic death is a very real thing, but medications that she already had a sensitivity to definitely seemed to kind of play a part in this. People typically believe to kind of look to the more supernatural reasoning, but if you look at the actual details and background, it begins to paint kind of a clear picture. But again, I wasn't there, so let me ask you, what do you think it actually was? Mundane or otherworldly? But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, leaving a like helps get this video out there. You hear that crap all the time. I know it's annoying, but it really does, as YouTube's algorithm is structured on people liking stuff. Subscribing is also a great way to be notified in the future if you enjoyed this video as well. I really do appreciate, again, all the support on the channel. Hit the Notre Dame bell if you want to be notified. But that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one.